Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 77, Aratong. Aratong is a home that was situated in River Street in North Deniliquin, a town in southern New South Wales, and it has an interesting history. It was originally built in 1859 as a hospital, a working men's hospital in fact. Aratong was erected to cater for the employees of squatters, who were in the majority of the Deniliquin population at the time. And the foundation stone of the Working Men's Hospital and Benevolent Institution was laid on the 22nd of January 1859 by Mr. Henry Sayer-Lewis, the oldest settler in the Deniliquin area, and the work of the hospital commenced in tents erected nearby. The main building and the wings comprised altogether of 9 rooms of all sizes to accommodate upwards of 40 patients. The surgeon proposed to build a residence on his own land alongside so as to not deplete accommodation for the patients. The hospital was carried out with quite a whirlwind of enthusiasm, and a sum of over £2,000 was subscribed in just a few months. And they set subscriptions at £1 annually, and 7/10 of working men in the district contributed. Peter Stuckey of Mathara Station was the head of the subscription list with a donation of £1,000. Henry Sayer-Lewis and Peter Stuckey were influential in the early years of Deniliquin, and I've created a bonus episode based on these two men. You would have noticed the mention of the surgeon that was employed when the men's hospital was created, Dr. Alexander McGregor. Alexander McGregor was born on the 10th of December 1805 in Glasgow, Scotland. At 14 years old, he began working for Dr. James R. Moore in Glasgow, and in 1824, at the age of 19, he moved into Dr. Leslie's home in Edinburgh and was under his patronage. He married Jacobina Campbell Urquhart in Edinburgh in January 1834. That same year, he was licensed with the Royal College of Surgeons and was noted to be of moral and religious character. From 1837 to 1842, he worked at Kilfinnan, and in 1842 he became a surgeon to the 42nd Highland Regiment, later to become Black Watch, at Inverness, and at Berwick was also a surgeon to the 25th Regiment of the Line. In 1844 he became the medical surgeon to the South Hetton Colliery Company in Durham, England. Alexander and Jacobina had 7 children. They came to Tasmania in 1855, and by 1856 they were living in Heidelberg, Victoria, and Alexander was employed at the Medical Hall at the corner of Latrobe and King Streets in Melbourne. By January 1859 he'd moved to Deniliquin to take up the surgeon's position at Aratong. So it was noted in the local paper when Alexander arrived, and it was a letter from Dr. Jones describing the institution and what its objects and aspirations were, and it also referred in laudatory terms to the first resident surgeon, Mr. Alexander McGregor. By his kind, skillful and humane treatment of the patients since the opening of the temporary hospital, has won for him the great respect of all and the confidence of the patients in particular. Mr. McGregor's very high testimonials justified our expecting from him these qualifications, and we have not been disappointed. But of the 35 persons who have already received the benefits of the institution, there have been very bad cases indeed, requiring all latent resources of the skillful surgeon. So Dr. Jones very pleased how Alexander had performed. However, he died in January 1860. In the first issue ever of the Pastoral Times on the 30th of January 1860, death of the surgeon to the Working Men's Hospital. At 11 p.m. on Friday the 30th, Dr. Alexander McGregor, surgeon to the institution, died in the hospital. He had been in infirm health for some months, but there was nothing until the last few weeks to excite any uneasiness in the minds of his friends. He had several years since he had been attacked with cholera while in Scotland, and this left him in a weakened state of health, which ultimately induced him to come to Australia. He arrived in Tasmania in 1855 as surgeon to the ship Australia-Asia with immigrants and other parties. Dr. McGregor, who was a member of several of the learned societies in Scotland. Dr. McGregor was a person of great experience in his profession. He was well up in every branch thereof, having pursued his studies with uncommon zeal. The worthy man whose death we now record was a kind-hearted physician and a very able surgeon. He loved his profession, and although he could not afford to give his services at all times gratuitously, yet our experiences of him during his brief connection with the institution in which he died satisfied us that he possessed a warm and generous heart, that he looked to the profession more as a means of doing good than making money. He always leaned to the safe side, that is, he preferred that the institution should suffer imposition temporarily than that the applicants for relief should be thrust away needing medical aid. But once Dr. McGregor satisfied himself that the man was imposing, the doctor was firm as a rock. A house surgeon demands so much medical acumen, so much patience and discrimination. The hospital had opened in tents as a temporary measure until the brick structure, just completed, in which the worthy doctor died, was fit for habitation. In these tents, Dr. McGregor, for the better part of a year, fulfilled his duties with unsparing zeal until at length disease overtook him, and although earnestly asked to take change of air, he put off and procrastinated, refusing to yield until it was too late. He died from colonial fever at 11 p.m. on Friday the 30th of December, having commenced his duties in January. Thus, he was a surgeon of the institution for a little under 12 months. He was chosen by the trustees of the institution out of 30 applicants. His high recommendations, not only in his profession, but for his humanity and zeal, placed him far above his competitors, many of whom were superior persons, and his conduct did justice to those who placed him in charge of the institution. His extensive practice at Southampton, where he would sometimes have 8 or 10 fractures to set, dislocations to reduce and amputations to perform in one day, made him a surgeon of no mean order. In fact, as a physician or surgeon, he was possessing uncommon nerve, great skill, and he was well adapted for the office of resident surgeon. The institution and the district have experienced in his death a severe loss. He was all gentleness and good nature, which almost invariably distinguish minds above mediocre. The more we knew of him, the better we liked him. His outward appearance commanded respect. He looked the physician. Although only 50 years old at his death, his hair was white. Dr. McGregor has left a widow and several sons and one daughter to mourn his loss. Mrs. McGregor is expected out, we believe, in March. The daughter has been adopted by Lord Ravensworth, we believe this is the nobleman, who has taken Miss McGregor under his charge in consequence of some kind act done towards his lordship by her father. Dr. McGregor's remains were conveyed to the grave in the Deniliquin cemetery on Sunday the 1st of January. The funeral was attended by a large number of settlers and residents of the towns. Dr. James Watson, the first mayor of Deniliquin, said that Dr. McGregor was a young, good specimen of an educated Englishman with gentle manners, high-spirited, and with plenty of go in him. So Jacobina was living in England at the time of Alexander's death, and it seems Jacobina and 3 of the children did not come out to Australia until December 1861 on the ship Lilies. And the 3 children that accompanied Jacobina were Jacobina Jr., Alexander and Duncan, and her son Henry's wife Jane also emigrated at the same time with their daughter Jacobina, who was 1. Alex's wife Jacobina died in Wellington, New Zealand on the 21st of July 1876, aged 70, at the residence of her son Henry. I can't find any evidence of her emigration. However, I am under the assumption that she quite possibly emigrated to New Zealand with her daughter. Jacobina and Alexander's son Henry had already emigrated to Australia, so I am assuming that Jacobina Sr. and Henry's siblings and his wife and child all came out at once to join him. On the completion of his apprenticeship as an engineer, Henry went to sea in 1860 and he embarked at Liverpool on the ship Lightning. He arrived in Victoria and he joined the engineering staff of the SS Blackbird. Henry soon found employment in the Williamstown Railway workshops, and then he went to the diggings where he obtained a situation as an engineer for a mining company at Daylesford, Victoria. Once he left the diggings, he took a position as an engineer on the SS Lady Darling and later on was transferred to the engineering staff of the SS Tararua. In 1868, Henry and his wife Jane emigrated to New Zealand. For several years, he was engineer on the SS Moa at Lyttelton and was subsequently foreman of the Otago foundry at Dunedin. In 1875, he joined the government service as an inspector of machinery, a position he held for 20 years. Jane and Henry had 9 children, and he died in 1908 at Karori, Wellington, New Zealand, aged 69. His sister, Mary Ann Jacobina, was 14 when she emigrated with her mother in 1861 to Australia, and she went to New Zealand in 1873, I'm assuming with her mother, and she died of tuberculosis, aged only 27, in August 1874 in Dunedin. Alexander, he was 18 when he emigrated with his mother and siblings. He stayed in Australia and married Mary Kelly in Newcastle, New South Wales in 1872. They had 9 children. He was a butcher and they lived in Newcastle until his death, aged 90, in 1933. Another son, Napoleon Robert McGregor, came out with his mother and siblings to Australia. He was an engine driver and lived at Port Melbourne, and he died in Port Melbourne in 1918, aged 83. He had a wife, Eliza Robinson, and 5 girls. Another son, Duncan, married Harriet Foster in May 1873 in Hay, New South Wales. At the time, he stated he was a training groom. They had 13 children. They moved around quite a bit. They lived at Hillston, Menindee, Bowden in South Australia, Wilcannia and Whitecliffs. And he was charged with stealing mail bags in 1902 when he was 52 when they were living at Whitecliffs. However, he was dismissed of the charge. And they also lived at Broken Hill, which is where he died in 1933, aged 83. So nearly 2 months after the death of Surgeon McGregor, it was announced that Dr. Noyes of London, late surgeon of the Owen Glendower, was to be the medical officer attached to the Deniliquin Working Men's Hospital. He had made 3 voyages to India and Australia in ships, and Noyes was 25 years of age when he took up the position, and Dr. Noyes was a long-standing doctor in Deniliquin. There had been a hospital that was built on the other side of the river at Deniliquin, and after a lot of discussion, the 2 hospitals decided to amalgamate in 1861 and the Working Men's Hospital ceased in operation. It seems that Dr. Erasmus Wren practised from Aratong from July 1862 until February 1864, so it may have been used as simply a doctor's surgery rather than a hospital at that time. So after this, the hospital was converted into a home. It seems that Henry Ricketson purchased Aratong at this point, however he didn't make it his home of residence. Reverend John Maitland Ware was the next resident of Aratong. He was an Englishman who'd been born in June 1830 at Clifton, England. He married Elizabeth Bishop in Launceston in May 1852. They purchased land at Ulverstone in Tasmania in about 1850. Initially, the land was in her name and it was later converted to his name in 1856. It seems that they went to Ireland at around the late 1850s as his wife Elizabeth died in Dublin in 1861. He remarried over there to Elizabeth Stoney in November 1863, and they must have come to Australia not long after they got married, as John received the role of Reverend in Corowa, New South Wales in 1864. And the announcement of that on the 25th of June 1864, the Reverend John Maitland Ware has been appointed to Corowa. He recently arrived in the colony and was ordained by the Bishop of Goulburn when in England, especially for the ministration in this diocese, and much is expected from him. He was formerly a resident in Australia and went to England, from whence the bishop induced him to return. He is no novice to Australian life or character and is therefore supposed to be thoroughly adapted for colonial ministration. Reverend Ware moved his family to Deniliquin from around 1869 to 1875. He was Reverend at St Paul's Church and he covered Moama and Boorluggal as well as other places in between, in addition to Deniliquin. By 1878, Reverend Ware left the district, and he was at Young, working as a chaplain in the jail, and then was the Reverend at Burrangong near Young in 1880 and St John's in 1884. On the 23rd of September 1881, church squabbles. Before the close of the meeting, Mr W.J. Watson said that he had heard that Mr Ware had been threatening some members of the congregation. So about 10 months later, Young. The differences between the Reverend Mr Ware and his congregation seemed to be as far off healing as ever. 7 months later, in Young, the initiation of the new school system here on Monday morning was not without incident. The Reverend Mr Ware, as incumbent of the Church of England denominational school, locked the gates and refused to give admission to children or teachers who were kept for some time exposed to the heat of the sun. The children afterwards attended at the public school, which is in consequence overcrowded and unhealthy. The department has been communicated with, but up to the present no action has been taken. So a little over 2 years later, proposed testimonial to a clergyman, to the Reverend Mr Ware, lately incumbent of the church, who has resigned. So that was in June 1885. So he'd endured, by the looks of it, about 4 years of discontent within his congregation. Reverend John Ware died on the 12th of August 1885 at Maruya, New South Wales, aged 55. His youngest child was only 4. And an article outlining his death. Intelligence was received at Young on Thursday morning of the death of Reverend J. Maitland Ware. The Reverend gentleman had been in failing health for some months, attributable in a large measure to the unhappy differences that had existed for the past few years between him and his congregation. Some months ago, Mr Ware's health broke down, and finding himself unable to continue his duties, resigned unconditionally in the hope that a change of air and complete rest would work a cure. To this end, Mr Ware went to reside in a sea-coast district, but unfortunately the change did not produce the desired effect. We're glad to learn that the widow and family are left in comparatively comfortable circumstances. Henry Ricketson. The best way to outline Henry Ricketson and his contribution to Deniliquin is by reading his obituary. So, death of a Riverina pioneer. With deep regret, we have to announce the death of Henry Ricketson Esquire of several Riverina stations, which took place at his residence Glen Ira, Caulfield, Melbourne, at the age of 75. Mr Ricketson was the third son of Mr Henry Ricketson of Annapolis, Nova Scotia, British North America. He was born on the estate which was granted to his grandfather by King George IV in 1776 as a reward for his loyalty at the time of the American War of Independence, as he was the only one of the brothers who would not take up arms against the Crown. He left America for Australia in 1832, and in 1853 he bought Barada Station. He also purchased later Bundy Ullenblah, known as Bundy, and Corinbin stations, which he afterwards disposed of. At the time of his death, he owned Cornella, Aratula, Billabong and Nurramang stations in New South Wales, and Delatide and Bushan in Victoria, and Yarranvale in Queensland, all of which are valuable properties. He was a man of great physical strength and of untiring energy, ever on the move, never better pleased than when his hands were full of business, always ready for a deal and generally successful. And until age began to tell on his vigorous constitution, he conducted his large business personally. He did not take any public position in political matters, although several times was asked to stand as a Member of Parliament for the district. He was a liberal supporter of the Pastoral and Agricultural Society and took great interest in its exhibitions and was always pleased when he was a successful exhibitor. He was a member of the leading race clubs in New South Wales and Victoria and was a successful breeder in horses. He greatly assisted in all public movements for the benefit of those in the district, both with his purse and advice, more particularly with the first bridge over the Edward at Deniliquin, the first telegraph at Deniliquin, and then the railway. He liberally subscribed and supported Mr Woolridge in his efforts to get the Freezing Works Company formed, some 5 or 6 years before the present working company was formed, and also did the same for the present Freezing Works Company. He belonged to the Church of England and was a liberal supporter both to the church and the hospitals, and in the early days he took an active part in starting the Working Men's Hospital at Deniliquin. He was an upright man of his word, good-tempered and genial with everyone, privately has helped many a lame dog over the stile and proved himself to be a friend in need with those in adversity. He married on the 1st of July 1858 at Yass to Georgina Hannaforth, youngest daughter of the late W. Hannaforth, MD of Sheffield, Yorkshire, whom he had 4 sons and 1 daughter. Just an aside, this surname was incorrect. It's not Hannaforth, but Staniforth. He married a second time on the 29th of July 1884 to Miss Edith Alice Ware, third daughter of J.B. Ware of Brighton, Victoria, 1 son and 1 daughter being left. He was buried in the family vault at Deniliquin on Monday the 31st of December 1900. So, as mentioned, Henry was born at Nova Scotia, and he arrived in Hingham, Plymouth, Massachusetts, USA in April 1850 from Nova Scotia, and he stated that he was a labourer. From the USA, he arrived in Australia on the 16th of October 1852, New York, and at this stage he listed himself as a blacksmith. He came with his older brother Joseph to Australia, who listed himself as a farmer. He was a big, strong, athletic man. He was 6 foot tall, which in those days was considered to be very tall. He was 18 stone and mainly muscle and bone. He is said to have set the record for the running high jump at a sports carnival in Bendigo. He used to swim his stock across the river, and one recollection was that an obstinate cow refused to enter the water and it broke away from the mob several times. Eventually, Henry grabbed the cow by its tail and swung it violently into an arc and flung it into the water. James McLaurin recalls in his memoir how the first time he saw Henry, he was riding an old white horse and armed with a revolver. His need for the revolver was that he travelled from Bendigo with a bag of gold sovereigns to pay McLaurin for cattle. Henry and his brother Joseph never got gold fever. They seem to have worked out that there was more consistent money in supplying fresh meat and purchased 3 small stations in the Riverina to fatten their cattle for the Bendigo market. The brothers purchased these separately, but then soon consolidated their holdings, and they obtained the lease to Barada from the Gwynn brothers in about 1856. Henry bought out his brother James with Barada in 1861, and by this stage he owned other properties of his own, including a home in Brighton, Victoria. He acquired Aratong and then Cornella in the early 1870s. At this time, he became a Justice of the Peace and took his place on the bench in the Deniliquin Magistrates Court, and Aratong was termed as his family's town residence. So they had their homestead at Barada, and they used Aratong as the residence when they came into town. And a descendant of the family wrote a letter into the paper giving a bit of a further insight into Henry, and it said around the time of his marriage, he was one of the largest landholders in the state. Henry also took possession of Upper Moira, which is now part of the Barmer Forest, across the river from his Cornella property. And Henry used a punt to gain access to both properties to move stock. In 1865, Ricketson bought a townhouse, Glen Ira, in Caulfield, and this was later used as a repatriation hospital for World War I soldiers and a home for trainee nurses. The home has since been demolished. By the time of his death, Henry controlled at least 80 pastoral properties. Just a little on his brother Joseph. Joseph was born in November 1820 and he married Margaret Yule in Victoria in March 1862, but he died only 5 months later in East Melbourne on the 10th of August, aged only 41. They had 2 children, James Henry and Josephine Edith. Henry Ricketson's wives and children. His first wife, Georgina Staniforth, as mentioned, was the daughter of Dr. William Staniforth and Amy Lowley. She was born in Sheffield, England in October 1833, and she emigrated with her mother in 1853. She married Henry in Yass in 1858 when she was 24 and Henry was 32. Georgina's mother Amy lived with the family in her old age and she died out of Barada Station in 1868. And I was talking to a family friend and how she actually recited the tombstone message and said how there was a tombstone that was in the cellar of Aratong. And this family friend lived with her family as a child at Aratong. And sure enough, I found articles in the local Deniliquin papers reminiscing about this. So the first one was on the 12th of August 1941. Tombstone 73 years old, discovered at North Deniliquin. A discovery of a tombstone 73 years old was made last week at Aratong, North Deniliquin, the residence of Mr. John Armstrong. Early Deniliquin memories have been revived by the discovery of a tombstone about a foot below the surface of the ground at Aratong, North Deniliquin, by a youth who was digging in the sandy soil. The inscription on the stone showed it to be in the memory of Amy Susanna, relict of the late William Staniforth, surgeon, Sheffield, Yorkshire, died at Barada Station, July 11th, 1868, aged 77. The body was reported to be buried in the Deniliquin Cemetery, but how the tombstone came to be at Aratong and lost is puzzling old Deniliquin residents. And there was a specific verse that featured on the headstone. Shrinking from the cold hands of death, I too shall gather up my feet, shall soon return my fleeting breath, and die my Father's God to meet. And in this article it refers to the original obituary of Mrs. Staniforth that was in the Pastoral Times in July 1868. On Friday last, Amy Susanna Staniforth died at Barada Station, Edward River, at the residence of her son-in-law, Mr. Henry Ricketson. The deceased lady was the widow of William Staniforth Esquire, an eminent surgeon who practised at Sheffield, where he died. He was a personal friend of the famous surgeon Sir Ashley Cooper. Mrs. Staniforth, soon after her husband's death, left England with her family for Munich in Bavaria, the Staniforths being of German origin. For many years they resided at Munich on the moderate competency left by Mr. Staniforth. Their son Samuel was presented with a commission in the Bavarian army, while William, the eldest son, entered the British Navy and is now a post-captain, he having distinguished himself in the war against China and in other places. The deceased lady possessed great accomplishments. An authoress, she was well known to many of the English poets, and while residing in this part of Australia, 4 years ago she published Australia and Other Poems, well known and appreciated by her friends here and in England. She was remarkable for her energy and industry. She lived and died a Christian, and her spirit passed away as though she were in a tranquil sleep. The remains are expected at Deniliquin, where they will be interred. And then another article, the old tombstone was formerly in Aratong's cellar. Mr. Thompson Corbell of Half Lewis Street called at the Pastoral Times office on Wednesday and was able to give us more information about the old tombstone that was found at Aratong last week. Mr. Corbell's father, the late Robert Corbell, was associated with Mr. Henry Ricketson of Barada Station for many years. He says that the Ricketsons lived at Aratong as a town home, and they finally moved to the big house in 1893. He remembers seeing it in the cellar at Aratong. Confirmation which Mr. Corbell is able to give seems to definitely confirm our opinion that the stone must have been taken from the grave in the Deniliquin Cemetery when the Ricketson vault was built. No one appears to have any idea when the vault was put there, but Mr. Corbell tells us that his father said it was constructed, if not designed, by Mr. Nelson, an Englishman, who did a great deal of building work for Mr. Ricketson at Barada and Cornella Stations and at Aratong. When discussing with Mrs. Everett, widow of the late Mr. Isaac Everett, the finding of the tombstone at North Deniliquin, Mr. Corbell was informed by her that there were 2 graves between the cottage and the Barada homestead in the horse paddock. One of the persons buried there was named Shepherd, a brother of Mrs. Henry Ricketson Jr., and the other was a man known as German Charlie, who looked after the turkeys at the homestead. Years ago, on the stock route just outside the main entrance to Barada homestead, there was a fenced-in grave under a willow tree. All traces of the fence seemed to have disappeared. The story handed down was that the man buried there died after a fracas at the Prince of Wales Hotel, which was a licensed house on the site of the Barada cottage. The late Mr. Isaac Everett and his wife lived at Barada for years. And further information, mysterious headstone. Mr. E.T. Matthews supplies further information regarding the old tombstone found at Aratong recently. My acquaintance officially with Aratong commenced in May 1903, at which date the Ricketson furniture from Aratong was sold in the premises now occupied by Mr. J. Tasker. About 1914 or 15, nurse Janet Henderson leased Aratong as a maternity hospital. I went through it with her prior to leasing, and the headstone was in the basement, not the cellar. You'll understand Aratong being built up on a hill. There are a number of steps up to the back door in the basement, referred to was the bricked up portion, which brought the back up to the floor level. Nurse Henderson, on seeing the stone, said it was a rather gruesome thing to have about a hospital. Subsequently, it was decided to reconstruct the laundry and to demolish some of the stabling, which had fallen into disrepair. The late G.H. Perrin was employed to reconstruct the laundry, and while there I suggested that the headstone might be of use to him and he could have it. He said it would be of little use owing to the inscription, which I have no memory as it was facing the wall. I take it that he subsequently took some of the bricks which came out of the old laundry to provide a foundation and buried the stone. And a further article, writing to the editor of the Pastoral Times, Mr. Staniforth Ricketson states that the old tombstone unearthed at Aratong would be that of his great-grandmother, as he was the son of the late Henry Joseph Ricketson, eldest son of Henry Ricketson of Baratza. His father's mother was Miss Staniforth, and her mother would be Mrs. Staniforth, whose name is on the old tombstone. Mr. Ricketson thinks the explanation about Mrs. Staniforth's body being placed in the Ricketson vault in the Deniliquin cemetery would be correct. On the 5th of June 1876, McCulloch and Jones Architects were used for additions, alterations and repairs to Aratong, and this was signed off by Henry Ricketson Esquire. And Georgina, Henry's wife, died at Aratong, aged only 48, in August 1882. And her death notice says, Ricketson at Aratong House, North Deniliquin, Georgina, the beloved wife of Henry Ricketson, after an illness of 3 months. Henry and Georgina had 5 children, 4 of whom survived infancy. Henry Joseph Ricketson was born at the family home Glen Ira, Caulfield, in January 1862. He married Sophie Henrietta Shepherd at Wellington House, Brighton Beach, in January 1883, at the home of Henry's stepmother's family. In 1909, he's listed as living at Toorak and being a mining investor. They had 6 children, and Henry lived in Hawkespoon in a home that they called Kylight, Hamilton, Victoria, and Nowra in New South Wales towards the end of his life. He died in March 1931, aged 69, and one of his children were born at Aratong in 1899. The grave that was found out at Baratza is Sophie Shepherd's brother. His name was Montague Shepherd, and he died on the 13th of October 1893 at the age of 29. The second child, Frederick William Ricketson, was born at Baratza Station in July 1863, and Frederick died at Mornington, January 1939, at the age of 75. Charles Nightingale Ricketson was born in March 1865 at the family home Glen Ira in Caulfield, and he died in South Yarra in October 1913, aged 48. And Amy Alice Georgina Ricketson was born at the family home Glen Ira, Caulfield, in February 1867, and she died in October 1916 at Toorak, Victoria, aged 49. Henry's second wife, Edith Alice Mary Ware. Henry married her at St George, Hanover Square, London, on the 29th of July 1884. Edith had been born at sea near Madagascar on the 2nd of April 1849. She was 24 years younger than Henry when they married. She was 35 and he was 58. Edith was the daughter of Jonathan Ware and Sophia Dunsford, and they had immigrated to Australia in 1839. By 1919, Edith had moved to London, where she died in May 1931. They had 2 children, Esther Edith Ricketson, born in October 1885 at Aratong, and Rudolph Ashley, born on the 26th of February 1887 at Aratong. He married Dorothy Mary George, who had been born in England, in St Margaret's, Westminster, London, on the 1st of October 1925. They had a son, Barry Ware Ashley Ricketson, in August 1926 in Croydon, England. In December 1938, Rudolph was living in Australia, and there was a divorce notice. Rudolph Ashley Ricketson, aged 51, of Fitzroy Street, St Kilda, from Dorothy Mary Ricketson, aged 33, of Fitzjames Avenue, Kensington, London, on the grounds of desertion. By 1947, Rudolph was based in Canada. He had a trip back to Australia, but died in Vancouver, Canada, in October 1968 at the age of 81. And in the Deniliquin Pastoral Times on the 5th of July 1949, there was a notice of how Rudolph had returned to his family home for a visit. Canadian visits Deniliquin. Mr. Rudolph Ashley Ricketson of Vancouver, Canada, visited Deniliquin on Thursday and Friday and was a guest at the Royal Hotel. He left for Melbourne on Friday and will sail on the Dominion Monarch for South Africa next week. Mr. Ricketson has extensive business interests in both Australia and South Africa and visits both places every 2 years. He has a close link with Deniliquin, being born here and spending his early manhood in the district. He is the son of the late Mr. and Mrs. Henry Ricketson of Barata Station, Deniliquin, his mother being Miss Ware of Melbourne, a daughter of one of the partners of the well-known firm of J.B. Ware and Son, Stock and Sharebrokers, Melbourne. In 1908, Mr. Ricketson left Australia to live in Canada, where he has many relatives. Mr. Ricketson's visit to Deniliquin was to inspect the family vault where members of his family are buried. Aratong was the Deniliquin townhouse, as the family called it, when they came into Deniliquin to shop or to attend the races and festivities. Mr. Ricketson has one child, a son 23, who's at Oxford University in England. When he graduates, he hopes to become an astronomer. And there was an article in 1900 where Frederick Wright Garstang, an Englishman who was born in 1848, was appointed as the new police magistrate for the Deniliquin district. So he was the police magistrate and the coroner in his time in Deniliquin. And it seems that his wife and children took a little longer to come to Deniliquin, as 5 months later it is announced that Mr. F.W. Garstang, who has been in Sydney for 3 weeks, arrived in Deniliquin with Mrs. Garstang and family. They've now taken up residence at Aratong. They stayed in the home until January 1908, so 8 years all up. He went on an 8-month holiday trip to England, and then in the September 1908 he chose not to return to his position in Deniliquin. On the 30th of April 1910, the body of Edward O'Rourke, caretaker of Aratong, was found in the river by Hugh Hannell. He was a crippled pensioner and was born at Roscommon, Ireland in 1840. On the 5th of May 1910, it's now reverted to a private hospital. At Aratong, North Deniliquin on Saturday, Mrs. Kavanagh, who conducted a private hospital there, was found dead in bed on the arrival of her assistant in the morning. The deceased had been under medical treatment for some time past, but no serious consequences were anticipated. So at this time, Nurse Henderson took over Aratong, and it was a private hospital and a maternity home, and she had it until 1920 when the Ricketson family sold it. So the property came up for sale on the 17th of January 1920, titled Important Property Sale. The trustees of the late Henry Ricketson are selling by public auction the following town property, very fine brick residence at North Deniliquin known as Aratong. John Armstrong was the next owner of Aratong. After the disposal of the furniture was leased to Mr. Shrivner, the district surveyor. On his leaving, Mr. Booth, the CP inspector, occupied it for some time. John Armstrong was born on the 20th of September 1872 at Yarrawonga Station in Victoria. He was the son of Adam Armstrong and Margaret Brown Telford, and lived at Wingadee, Coonamble and Milroy, Brewarrina, until he was 14, when his father died. He visited his uncle at Newrong Station on various occasions prior to this. At an early age, he entered the Melbourne office to gain business experience and commenced pastoral activities at Newrong Station with his uncle, the late Thomas Armstrong, who had acquired it in 1855. John at this time was about 18 years of age. He married Catherine Macaulay in 1895 in Moolameen, New South Wales. He was appointed as an overseer at Tupple Station for the late Frank Sadler Faulkner. His particular area of responsibility included Woodbury, which at that time was 80,000 acres. And then for 4 years he was a drover and sheep dealer. He held this appointment until 1900, when he went to live at Kinloch, a property of 5,600 acres that he acquired in 1895. He successfully conducted Kinloch until 1919, when he disposed of it and purchased the 11,300 acres of Woodbury, the northwest portion of the original Tupple Station. In recent years, part of Woodbury was acquired by the War Services Land Settlement Board, the remaining portion being divided amongst Mr. Armstrong's family. Aratong was the family's town residence, similar to the Ricketson family. He was a keen follower of the turf, and for 38 years was a member of the committee of the Deniliquin Jockey Club, retiring in 1946 when he was made life member. He was well known for his capabilities as a rider of rough horses, at various times owned and raced many horses, until advancing years forced him to relinquish the activity. Mr Armstrong, with the late Mr Murray Wise, was responsible for redesigning the Deniliquin racecourse running track. He was an old member of the Melbourne Cricket Club. Until he was 56, he was an active participant in cricket. In the days when Australian rules football was played with 20 men aside, he played for Carlton. He was also a noted swimmer in Melbourne in his youth. Mr Armstrong and his brother acted as pacemakers for a then well-known swimmer, Kernan. He competed in many pedestrian events, and in about 1880 he jumped 6 feet to finish third in the Victorian Amateur High Jump Championship. As well as for his sporting prowess, Mr Armstrong was also well known as a student of meteorology, particularly with regard to rainfall and river heights, statistics of which he had compiled over a period of 60 years. He took a great interest in native flora and fauna and spent many hours studying the habits of various native birds. He was recognised as an authority on pastoral history of Eastern Australia, more particularly in the Deniliquin district. John Armstrong, he had an unfortunate death. The local paper on the 28th of November 1950's article title is Body Recovered from River, Mr J. Armstrong's Death. The body of Mr John Armstrong, who had been missing for 2 weeks, was recovered on Saturday afternoon about 150 yards downstream from where it was believed he fell into the Edward River. With the death of Mr Armstrong, there has been removed one of the most interesting links with the early pastoral settlement of this district. He took a very great interest in world affairs, but despite his wide knowledge and varied interests, John Armstrong was a most unassuming man, and he was held in the highest regard by all who knew him. As a mark of respect to Mr Armstrong, a minute's silence was observed before the commencement of all Deniliquin District Cricket Association matches on Saturday. His wife died in November 1954, and she lived at Aratong up until her death. They had 5 children. The first, Muriel, was born in Ballarat in 1895. She married Francis White, an auctioneer in Deniliquin in 1921. She lived at Aratong from 1943 and into the 1950s while her husband lived in Melbourne. They had a daughter, Lois Francis, in 1925, who lived in Adelaide, and a son, Andrew, who was a horse trainer. The second child, Stuart Hay Armstrong, was born in Deniliquin in August 1898. Stuart returned safely from France in World War I, but was killed while riding at the picnic races in Deniliquin in 1922. He died at the age of only 23. The third child, Margaret Brown Armstrong, was born in Deniliquin in January 1901, and she married at the Scots Church in Melbourne to Hector Stanley Argyle, the younger son of Sir Stanley and Lady Argyle of Toorak. Sir Argyle was a medical practitioner and he was the Premier of Victoria. He was also knighted in 1930. Hector and Margaret ran Sir Stanley's orchard at Kangaroo Lake near Swan Hill in Victoria, and then they moved to Western Australia and continued to run orchards. They are buried with their son Ian in the Deniliquin Cemetery according to Margaret's wishes, and Margaret died in Western Australia in 1982. Their fourth child, Adam Alexander, known as Bill, was born in East Melbourne in July 1906. In his early 20s, he lived at Aratong with his parents and helped run his father's farming properties. He married Marjorie Hill in Wyandra, Queensland in July 1933 and returned to Deniliquin. They had 4 children, Janet, John, Peter and Robert. Bill was a grazier before he joined the 38th Australian Infantry Battalion in 1939. He was promoted to lieutenant in 1940 and joined the 2nd AIF on the 1st of September 1942. He served overseas in the Southwest Pacific from 1943 to 1945 and was awarded the Military Cross. After the war, he became involved in local politics. He served on the Conago Shire Council and as chairman of the Deniliquin Pastures Protection Board. In 1965, he was elected to the House of Representatives by the by-election for the seat of Riverina that followed the resignation of Hugh Robertson. He was a member of the Country Party and held the seat until 1959 when he was defeated by the Labor Party's Al Grasby. His great love was racing, and he was the official starter for the Victorian Racing Club from 1952 to 1969, 20 consecutive Melbourne Cups. It was for this and other public services that he was awarded the Order of the British Empire in 1972. And the fifth child, John Logan Armstrong, was born in Melbourne in November 1910. He married Dorothy Stokes in Victoria in 1941. He was a station manager and station owner of Uralla in the Echuca district, and he died in Midiamo, Victoria in December 1958, aged only 48. They had 2 daughters and a son. So Lorna Derbyshire then lived at Aratong, and she used the property as a school. So Lorna Mary Kathleen Derbyshire was born in Queensland in May 1900. Her uncle was James Derbyshire, and he was the secretary and later manager of the Deniliquin and Moama Railway Company. She was a teacher in Melbourne in 1928 before taking up the role of governess for the Lowe family at Stud Park, a property near Deniliquin, in around 1937. Lorna started a girls' school at Aratong in 1938 before shifting it to a property called Laverstock in 1941 that was originally built as a doctor's residence for Dr. Noyes and other doctors, and she remained at Laverstock until 1963. Lorna's mother died at Laverstock in June 1951, and Lorna died in Melbourne in February 1991 at the age of 90. She did not marry. And in the pastoral times on the 22nd of July 1975, Aratong to be demolished. Aratong, Deniliquin's oldest standing building and one of the town's original hospitals, is to be demolished. Demolition of the premises in River Street will take place later this year, and several executive-type homes will be built on the site. In recent years, Aratong was converted to flats. A spokesman for the Historical Society said that it had been inspected by the National Trust some years ago, and although they showed some interest, lack of finance presented any action to purchase it for preservation. Last year, the architects estimated it would cost at least $60,000 to restore the building, and it is now believed that the figure would have been increased by 30%. So Aratong was demolished in December 1976, and it was on the instructions of Mrs. G. Adams, the owner of the property at the time. So a very valuable and historical home for Deniliquin that unfortunately was demolished, and it certainly had a range of uses in its time.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes